All right, someone's giving me a thumbs up. Okay, so all right, so I'm going to start off just with a brief introduction to who we are at Kida Consulting. As I know, there's quite a few people who will be new to us, and also people who know us. We've got a couple of things to share with you, some new stuff. And also then I'll just introduce what today's webinar is all about, and then I can hand over to our guest speakers. We've got 3 great guest speakers who are each going to talk, and then we'll do Q&A. So for those of you who don't know us, my name's Alex Blake. Kida Consulting is the company I started 7 years ago now to help charities secure funding and tackle strategic challenges or opportunities in terms of funding, and those are the 2 strands of work today. So basically we have a trust fundraising service, so we help charities to secure grant funding. We do that by identifying which funders are most likely to support them, building a clear, compelling and comprehensive case for support, and also tailoring that through specific funding applications. And then the other strand of the work, the strategic consulting, is where we help charities to address particular challenges or opportunities that are unique to them. So that might be around undertaking research, interviewing stakeholders, facilitating workshops with staff and trustees and so on, and then providing insights and recommendations so that those leadership teams, whether it's staff or boards or both, can make well-informed decisions on how to move forward, and that kind of varies. In terms of the types of projects, it might be about fundraising strategy, it might be something more specific. We've got a fairly simple, clear website, so you can find out a bit more about us on that. It's pretty clear, and there were just a couple of things that I wanted to signpost to you, because you can access those, might be useful. So on the insights page, there's a selection of free articles and guides. So there's a bunch of stuff that you can check out there that might be helpful. And then we've also developed last year our trust fundraising scorecard. So it's like a self-assessment tool, completely free, completely confidential, takes less than 10 minutes to complete. And just go through a series of closed questions, answer those, and then at the end it gives you a score in each of 5 areas of our trust fundraising framework, and it gives you a web page with a report that gives recommendations on where you could improve those scores in each area. We launched that last year, and there's over 200 charities have used it. We've had some really good feedback from people, both those new to exploring grant funding and also people that are really experienced, and they still found stuff that was useful to kind of give them that kind of benchmark of where they're at, and some tips on where they might make improvements, and the kind of content they could share with some of their colleagues outside of fundraising in their charity as well. And then lastly, on the training and events page, you can find details of these free webinars like this, and some of the earlier ones are on there with the recordings, apart from the ones where I forgot to press record earlier on when we're having some teething problems in terms of my technical expertise. And then also on there, we've got some trust fundraising training programs, which are now available to book. So we've got the live version, which is run through five modules delivered through Zoom, 1 each week over 5 weeks. And that will be starting on the 20th of April. That's delivered by my colleague Amy, who's got a much more engaging training style than me. So that's a really great program. There's an early bird rate on the tickets for the next 2 weeks. And that covers those kind of 5 areas of trust fundraising, and comes with a bunch of really useful templates and resources. There's some interactive activity to do, and there's some peer-to-peer support that we incorporate into it as well. So that's really good program, really good value. And then we've also we ran that one last year, and had some really good feedback on it. And what we're just launching now for the first time as well is similar content, but broken down. So you can, if you just want to access some training on one particular aspect, whether it's prospect research or building the case for support, or the kind of management of the program, building relationships and working with people internally and so on, you can just buy into one kind of bite-sized chunk, and also you can access it on demand. So you can access those training videos at any time, and that still comes with all the templates and resources and things as well. So if that works better for you, rather than doing the one session a week for 5 weeks, that's a good option as well, and that's really great value. Those courses are on Udemy, which you can find the links to them through our webpage. So if you're looking for any training, then check those out at another time. Coming back to today's webinar, today's not about training at all. It's not about the kind of nuts and bolts of how to write a great grant application. The thinking behind these webinars is really about bringing together guest speakers who can bring insight from their work in grant making, whether that's as a trustee, grants manager, an advisor or a partner, so that we can all better understand the kind of inner workings and the current thinking in various funders, and thinking about the kind of grant making sector and the various kind of topics that they're exploring at the moment. And then, of course, that can help you to understand, what funders are asking you for in terms of those application questions and those conversations you might have with them, and inform how you think about writing your applications and reports and building relationships with them and so on. And hopefully it just makes it a kind of a much more positive experience for all of us, both in terms of kind of grant making and grant seeking, and everyone that's looking to achieve that kind of social impact. So today we're going to hear from 3 speakers about their experience of working in grant making, particularly during the COVID pandemic over the last year or so now. And then we'll have about half an hour or so, at least I think, at the end for Q&A and discussion. So if you can post your questions in the chat function, just as they come to you during the event, my colleague Amy will keep a note of those and ping them through to me, so I can try and get us through as many of those as we can in the time we've got. Also, feel free to pop in there just your own kind of thoughts and experiences. It's always great to hear how different people are getting on and finding things. And feel free to kind of chat to each other and stuff using that function. I think only other bit of housekeeping is just to say, we've put everyone on mute, so just keep yourselves on mute to just limit any kind of background noise. I know we've all got kind of kids and dogs and everything else running about in the background, or lots of us have at the moment. So yeah, we'll try and keep things running smoothly by having everyone who's not speaking on mute. And you can choose whether you've got your video on or not. And in terms of what you see on the screen, you can set that. So you can set it so you either just see the person who's speaking on full screen, or you can have all the little videos, so you can see lots of people, and then whilst you can minimize it and have it in the background and stuff as well. So I will stop speaking. You've come to hear from the guest speakers mainly, so I'm going to hand over first of all. Oh no, my screen's telling me my internet connection's unstable. That's not a good start. Good job that I'm handing over at least. So I'm going to hand over first of all to Sarah Ridley. So Sarah's been Chief Grants Officer at the London Marathon Charitable Trust for the last 7 years, and has just left that role to go back to advising foundations and philanthropists on their giving, which is what she did previously, as well as lots of years of working both in grant making foundations and running frontline charities as well. So Sarah, I'm handing over to you now.
Thank you very much, Alex. Can everybody hear me? I assume that's okay. Good. Perfect. Alex, thanks so much for inviting me. I hope that everyone is happy and healthy and are coping with the disruption and uncertainty that COVID has created for us all. I know that most of you are from operational charities working on the front line, so I want to begin by saying thank you. Thank you so much for all you're doing, particularly now in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. I know that many of you are facing challenges, increased demand for your services, internal staffing and HR issues, concern about your organisation's income and funding, and in some instances, concern about your organisation's future survival. So I do just want to start by saying thank you for all that you and your colleagues are doing on behalf of the wider community. I know things are hard, and I am tremendously grateful for your ingenuity and commitment to serving your beneficiaries on behalf of us all. So thank you. Alex has asked us to talk about trends in grant making following COVID-19 and other developments. I thought I'd begin by trying to give you some insights into some of the issues that grant makers are dealing with, to provide you a bit of an understanding about some of the decision making and some suggestions of ways that we can assist each other going forward. The world has certainly changed dramatically when COVID-19 hit. Funders generally know how fortunate we are, but that doesn't mean that COVID-19 hasn't thrown challenges in our way. And it may be helpful to you to get a bit of background insight into some of the questions that grant makers have been considering as we decide how to move forward. The issues are very similar to those that many of you are facing, but perhaps from a slightly different perspective. So I want to talk to you a little bit about some of those challenges, some of the responses that grant makers are making, with providing you a few examples from the London Marathon Charitable Trust, and then end just briefly by talking about how we might be able to support each other. So in terms of the challenges, they're the same old challenge that they always are. There's the legal rubric within which we work, our financial circumstances, and the other resources that we have available. So as always, grant makers as charities are bound by their memorandum and articles of association, which define what our objects are and what we're legally allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do. And no matter how great the need or how much we as individuals want to provide support for a particular issue, if, for example, you are a grant maker whose objects say that you are legally required to provide support for physical activity, as was the case for London Marathon Charitable Trust, we aren't legally allowed to provide support for the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, even if we wanted to do that. So that we are constrained in what we can do by our charitable objects. Of course, another major constraint is financial. Many grant makers have been hit financially just as the wider society has. Certainly initially, many endowed grant makers saw their investment income fall. Corporate grant makers, perhaps in the retail or hospitality sectors, might have seen income slashed due to poor sales on the high street. And then grant makers that depend on the trading subsidiary to generate their income through shops or events, such as the London Marathon Charitable Trust, have seen their income fall and have therefore had to make decisions based on having less income available than was anticipated at the beginning of the year. Other resource issues that we're all dealing with are, of course, those in relation to staffing, staff who are having to juggle work and caring responsibilities, organisations that may not be set up for home working, Zoom and Skype, and just the speed of response. Grant makers perhaps aren't at the forefront of speed of response, and many have systems and processes that seek to be methodical and fair, but that can mean that processes take time. So those are some of the ongoing issues that grant makers are dealing with. In terms of response to the particular circumstances of COVID-19, I guess the question that we've all been asking ourselves is, where and how can we make best use of our resources to deliver our charitable objects? What resources do we have? Financial, staffing, our networks, our influences, and how can we best use them? Funders are keen to understand the changed circumstances so that we can make well-informed decisions. So many of us have been in the information gathering, listening mode, and funders have been keen also to understand how they can complement government money and address gaps. So certainly some of the challenges that the Charitable Trust has faced is falling income, finite resources, certainly for now, but the belief that income will increase again once trading resumes. So where can our resources make the biggest difference in the face of tremendous need? London Marathon Charitable Trust supports the physical activity sector, and we know that the community leisure centres have seen a 40 billion shortfall, and certainly a single grant maker cannot fill every hole. So we've been asking ourselves questions about which organisations are addressing need in communities that have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19, and indeed which organisations can we not afford to use. Some of the challenges that grant makers have been considering are, as I say, where best to use the resources that they have. Should we be focusing on past beneficiaries, current beneficiaries, or future beneficiaries? These are hard decisions that we have to make when there are reduced funds available. Many trusts and foundations launched COVID-19 resilience funds or other emergency grant programs. A lot of those were one-offs, and that funding is no longer available. So we're not yet clear what the picture is about funding for the future. But a good number of us have decided to focus on current grantees to ensure that they are able to deliver the work that we've already supported, rather than funding new initiatives at this particular point in time. You're perhaps aware that over 350 funders have signed up to the We Stand Together pledge that was initiated by London funders, in which grant funders have committed to 6 main ways of working with grantees. That's being open to adapting activities, acknowledging that agreed outcomes might not be achieved in the timeframes that were originally agreed when a grant agreement was signed up to, discussing dates. We really don't want to add any pressure to organisations to meet tight reporting deadlines, providing financial flexibility by allowing organisations to use money differently, by buying equipment or covering staff sickness where that's allowed under the trust deed, and listening, really listening, encouraging frank conversations between funders and grantees, so that we can be supportive of your needs as possible. And I think that's one of the key things about this moment. It's always been important to have open and frank dialogue, but now more than ever, we need to share information to help us all to provide support. So to just give you very quickly an overview of the London Marathon Charitable Trust, certainly we are unable to provide funding for everybody. So we have decided to focus on current grantees and supporting those where there has been big impact of COVID-19 on particular communities. We're looking closely at the role of organisations in their communities, their ability to deliver, and the resilience of those organisations. I mentioned the importance of communication. We've been working with our grantees on information exchange by hosting webinars, Slack groups, discussion forums, so that we can learn from grantees can learn from each other. and building that support and trust so that we can ensure the resilience of your organisation and of the sectors. I want to emphasise again how important communication is at this time. There's often discussion about the power relationship between grantees and funders, and it's normally said that the grant makers have the power because grant makers have money. And certainly that's true to a certain extent. But actually, I think the real power lies with those people on the front line, because you are the ones who have the knowledge about what's going on the ground and what's needed on the front line. And knowledge is power, and I think it's really incumbent on each of us to share that information so that we can make the interventions that are most impactful at this time. So really think about the knowledge that you have and how you can help share that with grant makers. I'm afraid it's hard. Information sharing takes time. And I know that you are all very, very busy delivering on the front line, and that many grant makers actually are very small and don't have the ability to interact with you. But where you can establish a relationship with your grants officer, with a grant making organisation, please take this opportunity to be clear about what's happening for you, your organisation, your community, your sector, so that we can build that relationship of trust and transparency. Please be very frank about your own circumstances, your financial circumstances, and what's going on in your community. I know that grant makers can be demanding of time in terms of wanting to seek that information, and we bombard you with surveys and things like that. But if you are able to share information, that information does get shared more broadly between grant makers. It is a great time for building on the relationships that you have with other organisations in your sector, so that you can come with one voice to a grant maker about what's needed in your community or your sector. You can serve as very important eyes and ears for grant makers. So I think at this moment, the most important thing I can say to you is communicate, communicate, communicate. Be open and honest. What are you seeing and experiencing? What's happening for your organisation? And we will listen to what you're saying, and please hold us to account if we don't listen. So I hope that's been a bit of a whistle-stop overview of some of the thinking of grant makers. Everyone is having to make hard decisions at this moment, but we can achieve more together. And if we are well armed with information about what's going on the ground and the challenges that we face ahead together. I look forward to chatting with you in just a little bit, but I'll hand back to Alex now. Thank you.
Right, thanks, Sarah. That was really, really interesting. And I think, yeah, definitely a kind of a couple of themes there that come through from our experience of working with charities and that other people shared with us. And I think that kind of, those points about knowledge and trust really resonate particularly. Just wanted to kind of share that point before it pops out on my head again, because I think we often talk about kind of trust and how, you know, how grant makers can fund based on trust in organisations and that sort of thing. And so then the question becomes, how do we get them? How do we become a trustworthy charity? You know, how do we kind of show that? And I think that kind of knowledge aspect is one of the key things there, because I think the charities that we see, you know, obviously we work with quite a broad range of charities, and some are more successful in their grant applications than others. And I think one of the key things is really showing that in-depth knowledge of the community that you support, whether that's a local community or a community of interest, a particular medical condition or whatever it might be. It's the charities that can really talk about, this is what's happening right now for the specific people that we work with, not the kind of, the big national stats. They tell you the scale of an issue, but it's that real kind of in-depth knowledge of what's going on the ground. And when that comes across, then as much as funders have those particular questions about what are the outcomes, what those kind of specific questions, it's kind of getting that sense, yes, we can trust this organization because they're really clearly kind of experts in what they do, whatever the field is. So that, that definitely resonates a lot with our kind of work. Great, I'm going to hand over next to Ngozi. Just a reminder, everyone, if you've got questions or comments on Sarah's talk, then pop them in the chat and we can come back to those towards the end. So Ngozi has tons of experience in the sector as well. I think, 17, 18 years of the National Lottery Community Fund, including time as Director of England grant making, and more recently advising a number of the kind of leading foundations in the UK. Brings huge insight from all of that work, as well as various roles working with charities on the front line on that side of things as well. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Ngozi, so that you're unmuted. Okay.
Really?
And when you want to show your slide, actually, I'll change the setting now, and then you can do everything you want.
Fantastic, that's great. So thank you very much for having me, Alex. It's a real pleasure to be here today. My name is Ngozi Cole, as Alex said. My background is in grant making. I was England Director at the now National Lottery Charities Board for nearly 2 decades. I'm now self-employed. I'm a founder of a support agency called GLT, and I have a portfolio of executive, non-executive, consultancy and advisory positions. And I work in an advisory capacity for 3 foundations: Hamlyn Foundation, the Lloyds Bank Foundation, and also Virgin Money Foundation. So Alex has asked me to come along and talk about trends in grant making, particularly around EDI. But before I do that, I just want to acknowledge where we are with COVID. So many of us know people who might have passed away, people who've had COVID, people who've recovered, people who might be ill, even as we speak. So just to pass my thoughts, my sympathies to everybody who might be in that position. Also, there's a heightened anxiety, isn't there, in terms of us and our work. So you might have little kids trying to break your door down and come in. I suggest you let them in and sit them on your lap. You might have the little pets jumping around, let them. This might be your 2nd or 3rd meeting of the day, and that is not a joke, and you haven't had a coffee. Switch off your video, go and get a coffee. Let's just look after each other and think about each other as we continue to exist through this pandemic. So I just wanted to say that. So I plan to cover what funders are doing around equity, diversity, and inclusion, the approaches they're taking, and what this might mean for you when you apply for funding. Now, I recognize that discussing EDI feels uncomfortable for some people because it might pull at your heartstrings in a particular way, or you might have a reaction that suggests that a focus on EDI means that other people who don't have protected characteristics somehow lose something. Now, all of those feelings are absolutely valid, and I suggest you embrace that discomfort rather than try and fight it, and let's just have a conversation. And I hope you will use this as a chance really to ask any question that you might have about EDI. So why the interest? You may have come across a quote by a woman called Verna Myers, an American expert on equity. And she talks about equality being about inviting somebody to a party, but diversity being about asking them to dance. So it's not just about ticking a box and doing job done. It's actually about how do you really involve people. So we're all aware of the importance of equalities. We have the Equalities Act 2010 that protects people with certain characteristics. I bet that many, if not all of you, have had policies on equality for many, many years. Now the conversation has moved, and I'm about to share my screen now, and I hope it works. Can everybody see the screen? Yeah? I'll try and make it bigger. So in this screen, you can see that when you talk about equality, this is by a group called Agents of Good, by the way, and it's available online. Many of you may have seen it. But when you talk about equality, you can see the three people trying to watch this football match, and they're all on exactly the same box. So the first two people can see, okay, they're having a good time, and there's a little person there who still can't see, even though he's got exactly the same box as everybody else. And then you move in and you start thinking about equity, and that figures out that the tall guy doesn't need a box at all. The person in the middle needs a little bit of help, so she's got the same box. I think it's a she anyway, that they had under equality, but the little guy now has a bigger box on which they can stand. So this produces equity. People get the support they need. You don't treat everybody the same. You treat people in terms of what they need. But I suppose the end goal for me is around this idea of inclusion or justice, where actually the barrier was the fence all along. And if you pull the barrier down, nobody needs to stand on a box. Nobody needs to break their neck. Everybody can enjoy the game. So I suppose for me, that's the idea behind equity that is really important for us to be thinking about as we discuss what funders are doing. So 2020 really forced EDI to the forefront of our minds. We all saw George Floyd murdered in the States. He was not the first Black man to be murdered. It's not the last. We also started to talk more about injustices and murders right here in the UK. The Black Lives Matters movement has been around for many years, but absolutely catapulted onto the world stage following that murder. And we're all in the midst of the worst pandemic to hit humanity for decades. And COVID-19 didn't create inequality in itself or inequity, but it kind of exposed and exacerbated some long-standing inequalities. And that's why I guess many funders are interested. So just a few stats to illustrate. Around 1 in 4 children in households headed by people from an Asian background were in persistent poverty, compared to 1 in 10 children from white British households. And that's research by the Runnymede Trust. Research by Pro Bono Economics stated that 87 of people from minority ethnic groups, of charities, working with people from minority ethnic groups were at risk of permanent closure within 3 months, compared to 10% of the charity sector as a whole. This was done last year, so it might have changed. And then the Health Foundation talks about the risk of COVID-19 related deaths being 4 times as high for people from Black ethnic groups as opposed to those from white groups. And it's not just about race. So the Office of National Statistics talks about people with disabilities having a significantly higher mortality rate from COVID-19 than other people. And it doesn't stop there. Deprivation also plays a critical role in inequity. And 25% of critical care patients with COVID-19 are from the deprived 5th most socio-economically deprived areas. So you can see that it's really not an equal picture at all. But then you have intersectionality coming into this as well. So us human beings are complex. You may be disabled, you may be Black, you might be living in a community that expresses deprivation. So your experience of inequity will be exacerbated by all of that. So this are the things that funders have talked to me about why this is of interest to them. So what are they doing? I think all funders have started to look at their EDI And many started to look inwards at their own policies, their own practices, their own ways of working, and their own success rates to try and identify what the barriers were and any unconscious biases that may be in place. And we all hold unconscious biases. If you think you don't, just ask somebody who works with you or ask your family. They'll tell you what your unconscious biases are. It's about recognizing them, isn't it? Many funders refresh their own EDI strategies. Many, including the Paul Hamlyn Foundation and Lloyds Bank Foundation, made great public commitments of their planned actions and put them on social media. They put them on their websites. And some have brought people like me in to help them to take a critical look at all of their systems and to work hand in hand with them to do two things. One, identify what's working well, and there are several. And secondly, look at which areas might need to be reviewed. And some of them went on and actually made funding available. So Comic Relief awarded 3.4 million to 10 organizations working with minority groups to distribute the funding to small and micro projects across the UK. The National Lottery Community Fund did a big COVID-19 recovery program, and I know many of you on the screen were successful with that, but they also committed 1.4 million to support the creation of the Phoenix Fund for minority groups. Lloyds Bank also ring-fenced 25% of their COVID-19 program to minority groups. And they actually did better because they ended up with 38%, not 25%. So impressive things there. And then 13 foundations altogether came and formed what they call the DEI Coalition and made a commitment to prioritize work around EDI and to commit to working on it for at least 3 years. And their commitment is really to move from merely talking about the issues to taking practical action. And all of them recognize that this is a journey. It doesn't stop with a ring-fence sum of money. It doesn't stop with a commitment. They're all still working to promote inclusion over time so that the playing field can be more even. So that's what funders are doing. Just a few examples. I guess, what does this mean for you? I believe it's about thinking about what EDI means for your own charity and how you're involving people with the lived experience of the issues that you're addressing all through the work you do. So I'm here to find a funder that is forcing people to do anything. It's not about that at all. It's about asking questions and about encouraging people to take a look at that. Another quote I came across says, nothing for us or about us can be done without us. And I don't know who to attribute that quote to, but it certainly isn't original. And I think that cuts across all of DEI. James, I see your question is the DEI coalition. So funders recognize the benefits of properly involving people with lived experience in any projects. Benefits like dignity, value and respect for those people, but also benefits for you as charities, such as a greater sense of community ownership and benefits for the wider community, such as dispelling community fears, dispelling anxieties around them and us, and really looking at how we can do better. So funders may be looking at how you're engaging people with lived experience of the issues you are facing meaningfully, not just tokenistic. And just to give you a really interesting example for me anyway, often as a funder, obviously I'm an ex-funder now, you'll look at an application and it will say things like, oh, we take very seriously how we're involving people with lived experience and we make sure they're fully engaged, etc., etc. And then you go down the application and there's no further mention of that. And you hit the budget and there's no reference to things like translation, interpreters, access for disabled people, etc. So you start to wonder, well, how serious is this really? So I leave that with you. So I guess, what can you do just to conclude? You might want to start, if you haven't already, and if you have started, well done, continue to have conversations in your organization about EDI, the protected characteristics. What are you doing? What more can you do? What do you need to do internally? What do you need to do externally? You might want to be ready if anybody asks you questions about your approach. And to help you with that, that DEI coalition that I mentioned has developed a free self-assessment checklist that you can use to review your own organization, again, to uncover strengths, but also to identify gaps. I'm very happy to share that if you need. You may want to refresh your own EDI strategy, but note that it needs to be meaningful and not just words on a page. As part of this, you might want to have a look at your board and staff teams and see whether it's representative of the wider community that you serve as well. But I guess you also need to be thinking across your wider community, not just those that come to you, who's coming to you, and who else is actually not coming to you. For example, you might live in a totally wide community, but what happens when somebody like me knocks on your door? How welcoming is that going to be? How do you think about those things? So I encourage you to think really deeply about how you can engage with all categories of people with lived experience, how the people you work with can truly be at the heart and the head of your charity, and how you can truly live that Werner Myers quotes that we started with, so that you don't just invite people to the party, you actually include them by asking them to dance with you. I hope that's been helpful. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ngozi. That was really interesting. I love that little analogy at the end about asking people to dance with you as well as inviting them. That's really good. Thank you also to people that pop in useful links in the chat there as well. That's useful. And I don't know if I missed it. Did you mention the Baobab Foundation as well? I know that's another interesting new initiative that's popped up, new grant-making foundation that's looking to involve people from Black and minority ethnic communities in the whole kind of grant-making process and get funding out to those groups. Okay, so again, if you've got questions around Ngozi's talk, then please pop those in the chat and Amy will be gathering them up and we'll get through those towards the end. So next I'm going to hand over to Dr. Jan McKenley, who's been a trustee of the Paul Hamlyn Foundation since 2016, sitting on the migration and youth panels and the Foundation's India Committee, and is also Director of Public Service at Heart, and Jan supports organisations on their equality, equity, diversity and inclusion, and has been involved in this type of work for many years. So we'll have lots of useful stuff to share with us, and then we can all and have a conversation at the end and have a bit of Q&A. So I'm going to hand over to you, Jan, now. If you can just, oh, sorry, I've just muted you again by mistake. Can you just unmute now?
Okay.
Right. Okay.
Well, so just look. Yes. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me, Alex. And I would echo, of course, the things that Ngozi and Sarah have said about what a challenging time this is to live in, and also what a challenging time it is to work and serve. And you know, I echo all those sentiments about how it must be to be managing staff in this time, and managing sensitively as well as delivering, and trying to do all of that and much of it online. So I echo all of those sentiments. As Alex has said, I'm a trustee of the Paul Hamlyn Foundation. I've been a trustee since 2016. I sit on the Migration and Youth Committee, as Alex said, where Ngozi is one of our advisors. I am also on the India Committee. I sit also on what used to be called the Evidence and Learning panel, which has been recently reimagined, I suppose I should say, and we'll be looking more at strategic insight and effective communication and influence. I I'm also the PHF rep on Act for Change, which is a collaboration with Esme Fairburn on behalf of the I Will Foundation and the Community Lotteries Community Fund, which looks at empowering young people to lead the change they want to see. So I'm very clear about my role as a trustee. It is to hold the executive to account, to ensure good grant making takes place, to uphold the values of the foundation's charitable status, to manage and monitor risk and our appetite for risk, to scrutinise and do the due diligence done on grant applications, to take part in visits to grantees and potential grantees, and to be as supportive as trustee as the executive discharges its duty of care, not just to grantees and grant makers, but also to its own staff. I was asked to talk a little bit about what we've learnt during COVID, and to be open and available to answer lots of questions about some of the issues that are facing a foundation such as ours. It's a family foundation. Paul Hamlyn bequeathed, endowed 623 million. So I'm on a foundation that can give anything a minimum of 30 million pounds worth of grants each year. And that is a terrible, incredible privilege and both a challenge, as you'd appreciate. So I think that one of the things that set us up very well, if I move on to talking about what we've learned during COVID, is we learned a lot from the responses to Grenfell in London. We learned a lot from the terrorist attacks in London and Manchester about emergency responses. And we've been very much engaged in collaboration with others through some of the funds that both Ngozi and Sarah explained. We've also been had challenged by Brexit like anybody else, and we were on a journey towards we were beginning to think strategically about a more place-based regional view of grant making, which has actually been completely accelerated by, of course, COVID, where the local has become even more local and more significant. So one of the things we had to do as a result of that is to change our grant making. We froze our fund for our open grants process, and we focus very much on, as Sarah said, on our current grantees, supporting them. We also looked at becoming fleeter of foot. I think we probably joined as many of those collaborations and recovery funds and emergency funds as we could, and we thought about the responses to the pandemic, both strategically and tactically, but also operationally, so that we were, honouring our political neutrality, as it were, but also being involved with others to have a stronger voice in impacting on direction of travel. We'd already learned some of that for Brexit. We have a very strong migration panel, and we are very engaged in the support and changes to legislation for refugee and asylum seekers. So we brought all of that learning with us to try and think about how we might best respond to COVID. We had already started to have a kind of backbone organisation approach to which was which heralds some of the regional thinking we were doing, but and also we were very keen that the relational model, which we've developed over years, was not compromised. However, it wasn't also had to be. We had to become fleeter of foot in much the same way. So what does that mean? We trusted our staff before. We trusted the people that work for the foundation, but we've had to trust them even more, that their kind of instincts and their influence and their assessments of what was needed at this time couldn't wait till the next board meeting. And we've had to adopt structures that mean that we've been able to respond as quickly as the field needed and the sectors that we're supporting. And therefore we've had to change some of our governance arrangements to allow much more flexibility, much more a degree of licensing and permission in grant making that perhaps we wouldn't have had before, and we have learned from that. We certainly decluttered our website and Alex asked me at some point to talk a bit about how we see websites as at the foundation at trustee level, because we are often asked to significant grants are brought to board, and we as trustees are looking exactly as Ngozi said, to see that golden thread of values that start at the top and work their way through, that those are enacted, not just and transacted, obviously in the delivery of the organisation, but are also referenced very clearly in the websites. And that's one of the major things that we look at. We look at the trustees of an organisation too. We kind of do due diligence all the way, and we want to see some kind of coherence in an organisation that we're giving grant to. As everybody else has said, we're in collaboration with other funders and emergency responses, and we've also shifted our funding to encourage and enable grantees to be able to evaluate impact. We've not been looking to evaluate their impact as so much as we've been supporting. Once people are in receipt of our grants, we've been encouraging them to, by putting in aspects of the funding, to support their ability to evaluate and to advocate on behalf of the people they support. And we've been very involved in Tech for Good on that, encouraging a more wider understanding of the impact of social media and digital medias on grantees, grant makers, and also the people they serve. I think we've also had to look at our EDI, and Ngozi is helping the organisation do that. We've also had to think about the role of PHF as an employer through these times, and I'd be interested to hear, because with lots of the things that have happened this year, whether that be Black Lives Matters or Brexit, or the impact of COVID in people's individual lives and communities, that's now the kind of separation between work and life is very blurred for lots of people, and that has posed some interesting challenges, which I'm sure people around this screen will have found, from the fact that people feel that they want to make a difference. They feel they work for organisations that are claimed to be making a difference, and they'd like to see a difference made more active. So we've had some very interesting discussions among staff and trustees about the appropriate responses in times like these. We've put a lot of energy as trustees into becoming fleet of foot ourselves and to walking our own talk. We have a neighbourhood fund that we manage to support organisations within a mile of our building. And that is, since that's in King's Cross, you will appreciate that has been really, it is about putting your money where your mouth is. And our chair of trustees actually is the chair of that fund. So we've just to kind of, I said to Alex that I would be very happy to take questions rather than spiel on about PHF, since so much is on our website. We have had to become a more values-driven organisation ourselves. We've found a lot of pressure ourselves from the young people and the organisations that we serve. We have a youth fund. It's an active participatory fund, and I think we were always a learning organisation, but we've absolutely had to learn from our grantees and then our grant makers, our grant managers. So we have also become a more values-driven organisation than we were before. We understand that we're looking more on how organisations understand themselves as part of the wider ecology, how they work with communities who are facing inequalities, and what commitment they can demonstrate to increasing the range of stories told and the diversity of people telling them. And that's now much more actively upfront in our thinking, and as a grant making foundation, but also in our behaviours as trustees. So we think that some of those power inequalities that have been revealed this year are also questions for ourselves as trustees. They're questions for us on our board. how can we engage more how do we bring the next generation of young people onto boards as trustees? And we are moving we're going to be doing much more work on that ourselves in the coming year, but also on how we look very deeply at how organisations, the interaction between the board, the executive, and the communities that you serve, as Ngozi had said. I could go on, but I will. I suppose I would just like to summarise the kind of our role as a foundation. We are convening and collaborating to shift practice. We support specific campaigns to drive legal and policy change whilst maintaining political neutrality. We're shifting practice through supporting pilots and practice change. We're building partnerships and convening for change. We're using and reviewing our investment approach, and we're supporting new developments. And those are our priorities. And we've had to look again at our EDI strategy and under the same kind of challenge that many are, about putting our money where our mouth is or walking the talk. So I think that's been the kind of essence of COVID, hasn't it, for many of us, that we've been called out, we've been asked to step up, and we've been asked to do things differently, faster, swifter, but we've also been asked to do that whilst maintaining our values and our sense of purpose. So that's put quite a lot of pressure on us as trustees to also do that. And I just wanted to share a little bit of that with you today.
Great, thank you, Jan. That's really interesting again, and great to hear from kind of trustee perspective and to hear what you're doing at Paul Hamlyn, and really interesting to hear about those kind of 5 key priorities at the end there as well. That really kind of interesting mix of stuff that you're working on there, and certainly not, as fundraisers might sometimes think that grant makers are just about assessing applications and why can't they just get on and do that quicker and what have you. There's clearly a lot of work going on there to think about how you can have the most change, how you can include people in the best way, and that kind of thing. So we've got half an hour to do Q&A. I know a fair few people are having to leave to go to an 11 o'clock meeting, and people have 11:30 meetings and be wanting to duck out 5-10 minutes before the end and what have you. So just a quick reminder, we'll share the recording. We'll get that out early next week. So if you do have to miss some of the end and you want to catch up, you can skip to the last kind of half an hour of the recording and check out the Q&A bit. Also, when we send that, I'll just ask for some feedback and stuff. It'd be great to hear from any of you in terms of any suggestions you've got for future webinars, how we can improve on the format, and any particular topics that you want us to cover within that kind of grant making trends kind of umbrella. And also, I know we've got some people here from foundations today and who work with grant makers. If there's anyone who would be interested in being a speaker themselves, or has thoughts about who would make a good speaker and who's got useful stuff to share, then please do drop us an email. I'll be planning for the next one now that this one's done. Really, we'll do the next one probably in May. I think in a few months' time, around kind of May time. So yeah, it'd be great to hear from anyone that's got something they'd like to share. Apart from that, I think we'll move on to Q&A. Yep, Amy sent through some questions. I'll get them on the email here, and we'll just try and get through as many as we can. So speakers, if you're able to unmute yourselves, and then just jump in, whoever wants to contribute to these. Okay, so first of all, we've got, what are the most common traits that you find successful applicants share? I've got to ask you to unmute. Okay, So like from your experience, I know you've worked at different foundations, each of you. Are there some particular traits that you think run through in terms of successful applicants? What stands out as the things that you think the types of charities you fund might have in common?
I'm happy to make a start. I think it's Jan's point about a golden thread. So a deep understanding of the community that you're working for and what they need with their involvement, that translated into a plan for what you want to do. Obviously, I use the word plan a bit loosely because life has changed, as we've all recognized from our strategic plans that had to be chucked out of the window last year. But having a plan in terms of what it is you want to do to address that need you've identified. Thinking about how those people are involved all the way through and being very, very clear the difference you're actually planning to make, how you will measure it and how you learn from it. So for me, those are the big things, but underneath that lie other things like money, how you're going to manage the money, how you're going to look after your governance. But those for me are kind of building blocks that underpin the big thing, which is your why, what, how, when, and how will you measure.
Can I add to that? And I think that's a brilliant list. That when you've got all that in place, the evidence of impact that you're making through testimony of beneficiaries, others that you work with, is a very powerful way of bringing that together, what you've put down on paper, to have that backed up with support from beneficiaries, others in the community that really give evidence of your impact.
Right. So do funders expect to continue focusing on current grantees for the foreseeable, or will there be more scope to support new beneficiaries? I know one of the issues for charities who haven't previously had much grant funding and their income streams of trading or community fundraising have dropped. So they don't have the relationships, but they desperately need the grant funding now. So of course that focus is a challenge. So thoughts on that in terms of both the places you've been working, but and more broadly, if you've got that kind of knowledge.
Well, I think I know that we opened our grants again. Our grant making in October, and as far as I'm aware, that hasn't changed. And so, of course, we also are making a commitment to our current grantees, as others have said. But I think we kind of opened back for business. I think the other thing that we would say is that there are a number of these emergency organisations, emergency collaborations. We in these times we look for collaborations. So I think and that's quite a powerful thing for people to consider. And just to say a little bit more from a trustee perspective on that last question is, our youth panel has a value around asset-based and strength-based work. And so we're very clear about the criteria and our current thinking about what works best in the sector, from what the sector have told us. It's not our position. And in the migration field, we're certainly internally, we've used the theory of change model so that people can see that golden thread. And we, again, as Ngozi said, we try to we expect to see that. We do a lot when we do the sampling. As I said, we look at websites, we look at trustees, we look at what they say they do, we look at the kind of trustees an organisation has or on its board. We think that's really significant. We think governance is an important part of an organisation structure when we're giving grants. And so those are some of the things that we look at. I think we will see more opening up. I think there will be funds. And I think when people want to apply for those, I think some of the things we've said about what are some of those features are very important. I think we take participation and engagement with young people very seriously. And And we also take the engagement and involvement of people with lived experience or who have become experts through experience. So.
Right, thank you. And I think, yeah, I think generally more foundations are opening up. I know that I think they're a lot initially focused on current grantees and then started opening up. So next question is around the panel's thoughts on levels of charity reserves in the current climate. Are charities with high reserves at a disadvantage, or will it be seen as a positive in that it adds a level of protection for core services in the future? It's a question we've been asked quite a lot, and I guess it's always a relevant question, and then things have changed a bit because of COVID. So I think, you know, there has been more of a shift to funders wanting to support those with an urgent need and wanting to help organisations to survive. But then I know also there's sometimes that feeling of not wanting to give your funding to an organisation that's not going to survive anyway, because you can have better impact elsewhere. So it'd be interesting to hear the panel's thoughts on reserves. You know, what's too low, what's too high? Is there kind of, you know, have you got set restrictions around that or not?
Shall I jump in? I would say there is no one answer. It's not a one size fits all. What you need to be able to do is explain your level of reserve, why you have it or why you don't have it, and what you're doing to address all of the issues around this in terms of your longevity, sustainability, whether you're making the case that you need a large reserve to ensure your sustainability, or that you've been spending your reserve to deliver emergency services that are really required, and that you require money to replenish those reserves. I think being as clear as you can be about your level of reserve is the only right answer, and that's where that honesty, transparency and trust comes in. And I would say that a grant maker that has a blanket rule isn't doing it the best service that it can to the sector. I'm happy for others to disagree.
Spot on, absolutely spot on, Sarah. Absolutely nothing to add to that from me.
Great. A question we got for Ngozi on your talk on EDI, really asking, you know, how can we ensure that greater awareness leads to genuine change and not just short-term tokenistic grant programs. Also, as a fundraiser, it's tricky to change the way an organisation works to get better at EDI. So whether anyone has any tips on that, and yeah, trying to avoid things being a kind of box ticking exercise.
Yes, honestly, the box ticking, I would just not bother if it's going to be about box ticking. It's such a waste of time for the organization, but also for the people you might be wanting to work with. So for me, it always starts with a conversation. I believe it's about meeting people where they are and having a conversation about where you want to get to. So it's not a checklist you bring along and go, have we got this, have we got this, have we got that? It's actually, why don't we start with a conversation? What's our community? Who's in there? Who's coming through the door? And this is where the evaluation and stats that Jan and Sarah mentioned earlier comes in. How are you analyzing who's coming through the door? To be very obvious to you once you look at your data about who you're seeing and who you're not, and how it compares to the community. And then asking ourselves, do we know enough? For example, if you've got 0 disabled people coming through and using your services, why is that? Is it that there's really nobody in the local area that you're serving, or are there others? And I guess my second point would be kind of not assuming you have all of the answers, because chances are you don't. So in that a disability umbrella body around you that you can go to and go, oh, what are your stats? Are there people with disabilities in our area that we're not reaching? What are your suggestions? Can we come to a focus group? Can we come to a meeting and talk about our services, etc., etc.? So kind of having conversations like that. And then if your own be it an equality policy you have, and equalities, diversity and equity and inclusion, whatever it is, get it off the shared drive or off the filing cabinet and have a critical look at it and go, is this still right? What are we missing? Seeing as the world has changed so significantly, how are we changing with this world? How do we look inwards and think about the things that have worked for us for many years that may not be working anymore? And then from those conversations and that openness and discussion, you start to pull together some kind of action plan that might help you go forward. My final point is, please don't have an action plan that is a long list of 40 things. You will probably do none, or maybe you'll do one. Start with your top three. What are the top three things that we can do to make a difference? And then just do that. And after you've done that, take another look and see how you can improve. But my colleagues might have other points.
I have a personal view as well as a professional view about box ticking, and when it comes to EDI, and I think that people can get themselves into a lot of knots about manage not to act, and it is about taking that first step. So if that looks to you like box ticking, then go ahead, because if you're taking a step and you're trying something out, you're moving into a new direction, I think that's okay. I think that's because actually what people want more than anything else is action. It's action that gives them hope, not the talking and not the kind of angsting about whether it's box ticking or not. Try something out, communicate, try and meet the people who you're trying to serve, get some, have some humility about what they might be asking. If it's really tricky for you, then that's because that's telling you something. You might need some allies to do some of this stuff with. It's not always easy to do it on your own. Find some friends and allies and try and have those conversations. But I think action on this is, and then being quite honest about, we're taking first steps here. It's not going to be done in the first year, but we can't turn it around in a year, but we can begin to, and we intend to, and we hope to. But Greta Thunberg has a great quote about hope. She says at the end of every talk, somebody always asks her about hope. And she says, people are sick of hearing about hope. They would like to hear action. And when people act, then hope is everywhere. And I really like that quote.
Right. Someone asking about Brexit, any big unexpected problems from Brexit? Anything you're seeing come through in terms of applications? Don't know. I mean, it's obviously charities that were reliant on EU funding. There's questions over that. Someone's saying a lot of funders who have previously funded international work have stopped doing this and have focused more on stuff in the UK, more people focusing on the local issues. Do people envisage that changing at all?
Certainly, we have an India committee, and we have always we've probably expanded our commitment to the work that's going on in India at this time. It's not at the we are in a very fortunate position that our investments have not gone down through the pandemic, and so we're in a position to sustain and keep our commitments to international work of that kind. We also collaborate with other philanthropists internationally, and we will continue to do that, no doubt, on Zoom and Teams and wherever else people describe as those platforms.
Got an interesting question here. Someone's saying the funder statement was initially welcome, but now it seems like quite a kind of passive move given the current time. Now that funders have shown that they can award funding more quickly, should we be pressuring funders to change to making quicker decisions rather than the kind of quarterly and 6 monthly processes? And I saw another question pop up, which is kind of related. I think was asking about Paul Hamlyn and whether you're what you're doing to identify the success of those quicker grants. Are you happy that they they've been impactful in the same way as, you know, when you take 6 months to make a decision rather than 6 weeks, you know, or are there challenges in moving so quickly? So sorry, I've given you kind of 2 questions there. One about should we all be pushing for quicker processes and so on, and some of those improvements in grant making practice. And then also, you know, have there been challenges or have things been just as impactful?
Sarah, do you want to go first?
I will do. And I guess one of the things about the sector, the grant making sector, is when you talk about one grant maker, you're talking about one grant maker. You can't talk about all grant makers, because we all have very different ways that we're set up, the ways that we have to operate, and indeed the ways that we choose to operate. I certainly think there is the opportunity for certain grants of a certain type to be handled much more quickly by many grant makers. We've had a couple of examples, COVID-19 being one of them, Granville being another. But there are other kinds of grants, and I'm going to put my hand up and say my former role at the London Marathon Charitable Trust, where we were largely funding capital projects, support for buildings. We had to go slowly and carefully because we were investing many hundreds of thousands of pounds often. That wasn't something that a decision could be made really rapidly on, and we weren't the sole funder. So it's kind of horses for courses. I certainly think there are opportunities for collaboration, speedier working, but it's not a single route because there are so many different ways of funding and funding different kinds of projects. Jan, there were some questions about Paul Hamlyn also.
So the big question I think I can answer is that we've been really interested in what we've learned about grant making processes, what we've had to do in emergency settings, and what we can then apply to our day-to-day, our new day-to-day business. And the board has been very interested in that. We've got a board meeting in March. You know, obviously lockdown 3 has happened, but we are asking that question. You know, what have we learned? What can we do differently? You know, how obviously, like many, we're thinking about the issues around technology and technology and inequalities. We'll be putting ourselves under a lot of pressure to respond to the education crisis that we're seeing unfolding, and the recovery curriculum and those sorts of things. I think we'll find it very difficult to resist a request that we begin to engage more with schools than we have possibly done in the past. So I think we are definitely looking at the fact that we've become much more fleet of foot, and what would be the argument for going back to the old ways? You know, that's going to be the question we're going to ask ourselves.
Great. So sorry, we've got so many questions. I know we're not going to get through all of them. Points. Okay, I'm going to go on to the next email of questions. What could the move to more place-based funding mean for charities who operate nationally?
I'm happy to kick off on that one.
Thank you.
I think many funders that are going place-based often have a more open program that will pick up others. Not all of them, but many do. So I don't think you should be put off by that. So if I take the Lloyds Bank Foundation, for example, they've got a place-based program, but they also have 2 open programs that people can apply for. I guess the second thing I want to say is about the communication with your funder, especially if you're an existing funder, which is really critical. As Sarah's point about communicate. And I know that boards of trustees, certainly Jan and colleagues at Paul Hamlyn, are keen to hear what's going on. So if you see a policy or some kind of criterion that knocks you out, I would suggest picking up the phone and trying to have a conversation with whoever your main contact is at the fund and having a conversation with them about what the barriers are, what the issues are. And not all grants, not all funders do this, but a number have a little pot of discretionary funding that are meant to pick up exceptional cases such as the ones being described. So that's been my experience of that one.
Okay, so are funders reluctant to consider multi-year grants now due to the current uncertainty? Is there any more focus on just doing single year short-term grants at the moment?
I would say not, but again, it's hard for any of us to be able to crystal ball gaze at the moment. But the more you're able to articulate why you think your vision for the future still holds and how you can plan for different scenarios, I think that would stand that kind of application in good stead to show that you have some flexibility to still deliver the same kind of objectives, but perhaps in different ways with as much as we can imagine the future might look like.
Yeah, I think it's, I think in lots of cases it's challenging at the moment to put together multi-year project applications because there is that level of uncertainty. Bit easier in terms of core funding because you can talk about the need for the organisation as a whole and your kind of overall plans and what you do. Although I mean, some funders who have kind of thought about this and put it into their guidance have said, work on these assumptions, work on the basis of what the current guidance is and some expectations that you'll be able to do face-to-face work, towards the end of this year, perhaps, and, give a bit of guidance. And I think, as long as you put your assumptions into the application content, then, that gives a sense of things. And I think everyone knows at the moment that, there's so much uncertainty and things may well change. So any plans that you put in place are not set in stone. Okay, we've got 5 minutes left. I know more and more people will have to dash off and we will finish at 30:30 because I know the speakers will need to get off as well. So we'll just see how many more we can get through in the last 5 minutes. As I say, the recording will be there. I know there's some that we're not getting through, so I'll see if there's anything we can do to try and respond to some of this, or if there's a better way of trying to get through so many in future. Any suggestions again will be great. From people who have experience of doing webinars with lots and lots of people, because we're just getting more and more numbers on each one, so it just gets more challenging to keep on top of all of the questions. So someone here is saying we've had a really great response this year. Again, this chimes with lots of conversations I've had actually. People have actually ended up having a good year in terms of income, because where they've lost some income, but then they've secured plenty of emergency relief funding, so that they've actually done fine, but they're incredibly anxious about what happens in the next year. Next financial year could be much less successful. Like, how long can funders' generosity last? This person lasts, and will they be able to keep giving and making up some of that shortfall from other areas? So, and any thoughts from the speakers in terms of in the kind of year to come, will funders continue to be able to step up and give at the levels they have, or will we start to see less of that funding available, and maybe some of those kind of impacts on the funds that grant makers have to give away start to show a bit more?
I can say, in a foundation such as ours, there would be no reason to take a different approach right now. That we've got a consistent approach there's nothing in the financial situation for ourselves as a foundation, but we do understand how difficult it has been for parts of the sector, different sectors. So I think at the heart of what we're discussing is the need we serve, and if that need we serve continues and is intense, then we would be a foundation, if we have a relationship with you already, who would want to know and learn from you about what's changing and what needs to change. That's what drives our grant making. It's not the other way around.
I was going to add, I do know that some foundations have been hit by the markets really in terms of their endowments, and I've started to see a decline in income. And certainly some organizations that are funded by corporates that have been hit have also seen a decline in the income they're coming in. So that will translate at some point in time. Having said that, the markets are in recovery. As we know, it's slow, but there is recovery coming. So it's likely that even if there's a dip, well, I'm hoping that it isn't that noticeable, quite frankly, but without the benefit of a crystal ball, it's actually quite hard to tell exactly what the future will look like.
I tend to try and be very optimistic. And I think it's positive that endowed foundations looks like the markets are on the up. Yes, corporates and those with trading subsidiaries may be hit. Actually, the area that I'm more concerned about is local government and government funding in the face of, well, the economy in general and the impact of COVID. So I think there's perhaps a double whammy that we need to be attuned to and be planning for. I know the government is trying to pump as much money as it can into the economy, but we know that this is going to be a hit for a long time. So yeah, just a word of caution for us all.
Thank you. We're just tipping up to 11:30 now, so I think that's all we've got time for. So just to say a massive thank you again to our guest speakers today. I know lots and lots of people have been putting comments in, thanking you and saying how useful it's been. So thank you very much, and thank you to all the people that have been engaging in the chat function and putting in really useful questions and sharing links and everything. I'm going to be speaking to myself in a minute as everyone starts leaving, but thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
And I'm going to end the call now. And take care, everyone. Look after yourselves. Best wishes.
Thank you for asking us, Alex.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.